When most people picture Elizabeth Taylor's love life, they picture the glamour. The 8 weddings, the mountains of diamonds, the private jets, the marriage of the century to Richard Burton, the grand romantic saga of a woman who loved as fearlessly as she lived. It is one of the most famous love stories in the history of Hollywood, and it has been polished over the decades into something that looks, from a distance, almost enchanted. A great beauty, a series of passionate men, jewels the size of ice cubes, and love affairs that stopped the world. But that glossy version leaves out something important, and it is the thing this whole story is really about. Because behind the furs and the flashbulbs, at least one of Elizabeth Taylor's marriages was not a fairy tale at all. It was a genuine nightmare. It involved fists, not just diamonds. It involved a pregnant teenager being beaten, a miscarriage, a gun fired at a ceiling, and a young woman discovering, in the most brutal way imaginable, that the golden life she had been sold was a lie. And even the marriage everyone remembers as her great love, the legendary romance that the whole planet swooned over, was by the participants' own accounts closer to a slow-motion car crash than a love song. Vicious fights, blackout drinking, cruelty on both sides. 2 people who could not live together and could not stay apart. The truth about Elizabeth Taylor's marriages is far darker, far sadder, and far nastier than the romantic legend ever let on. We remember the jewels and forget the bruises. We remember the marriage of the century and forget that the phrase was used to sell a union that turned violent within months. We have turned a life that contained real terror, real grief, and real self-destruction into a kind of glittering costume drama, a parade of weddings and gowns and famous men. But the woman inside that costume drama was, again and again, genuinely suffering. This is the story of what really happened behind those famous wedding photos, starting with the very first one, the one that should have been the happiest day of an 18-year-old girl's life, and instead became the beginning of the worst year of it. The wedding of the century that hid a nightmare. In the spring of 1950, Elizabeth Taylor was 18 years old and quite possibly the most beautiful young woman in the world. She had been a movie star since childhood, since National Velvet had made her famous at 12, and now, on the cusp of adulthood, she was Hollywood's golden girl with those impossible violet eyes and a face the camera worshipped. And she was about to marry into one of the richest families in America. Her groom was Conrad Hilton Jr., known to everyone as Nicky, the 24-year-old heir to the Hilton Hotel fortune. He was handsome, wealthy, and charming. The great-uncle, incidentally, of the Paris Hilton, who would become famous decades later. On paper, it was a storybook match. The beautiful young star and the rich, dashing heir, and the wedding was staged accordingly. It was treated quite literally as the wedding of the century. Here is the first ugly truth hiding behind that famous day, and it tells you everything about the world Elizabeth was living in. Her studio, MGM, essentially owned her life at 18, and they treated her real wedding as a marketing opportunity. They provided her lavish satin gown, they orchestrated the entire spectacle, and they deliberately timed the ceremony to promote her upcoming film, Father of the Bride, in which she played, of all things, a blushing bride. Think about that. This young woman's actual wedding, one of the most personal days of any person's life, was scheduled and stage-managed by a corporation as a promotional stunt for a movie. To understand how Elizabeth ended up in this position, you have to understand the machine that had raised her. She had been a working actress since she was a small child, and the studio system of that era treated its young stars less like people than like valuable assets to be managed, controlled, and monetized. MGM shaped her image, dictated her public appearances, and reportedly worked to keep her sheltered and pliable. She had gone almost directly from being a studio-managed child to being a studio-managed young woman, with very little space in between to develop the ordinary judgment and independence most people acquire in adolescence. She had, by her own later admission, the emotions of a child in the body of a woman, and into that vulnerability stepped a rich, handsome, dangerous man. At exactly the moment a corporation was eager to turn her private life into publicity, thousands of onlookers crowded the streets outside the Beverly Hills church. Elizabeth, giddy and 18, reportedly urged her police escort to turn on the sirens so everyone would know she was coming. She had no idea what she was walking into, because almost the moment the cameras stopped rolling on that perfect wedding day, the fairy tale curdled into something horrifying. By Elizabeth's own later accounts, the abuse began on the honeymoon. Nicky Hilton, it turned out, was a violent alcoholic and a compulsive gambler. On what should have been a romantic getaway, he reportedly turned sullen, angry, and cruel, and the cruelty was not only verbal. Elizabeth would later describe herself, in the plainest possible terms, as having become a punching bag. The dashing young heir the public adored was, in private, beating his teenage bride, and it escalated to a place almost too dark to say out loud. During that brief marriage, Elizabeth became pregnant, and according to what she and multiple accounts have described over the years, during one of Nicky's violent rages, he assaulted her so severely, reportedly kicking her in the stomach, that she lost the baby. She suffered a miscarriage as a direct result of his physical violence. Sit with that for a moment. The image the world has of Elizabeth Taylor's first marriage is a glamorous society wedding, a beautiful girl in white satin racing to the church with sirens blaring. The reality, only months later, was an 18-year-old newlywed, pregnant, being beaten so severely by her own husband that she lost her child. There is no version of that story that is anything other than horrifying, and it happened to a teenager whom the entire world believed to be living a charmed and enviable life. This was not a brief rough patch. It was the shattering of a young woman's entire understanding of the world. Elizabeth had gone into that marriage as a sheltered studio creation. A girl who, by her own admission, had the body of a woman but the emotional experience of a child. Someone who genuinely believed in the happily ever after she had played on screen. What she found instead was terror. As she put it later, that was when the reality of the world hit her, the reality that the fairy tale was not real, that she was not safe, and that the man she had married in front of the whole world was a monster behind closed doors. There is something especially cruel about the timing of it. Elizabeth had spent her childhood performing happiness, playing wholesome girls in wholesome films, selling audiences the very dream of romance that her own life was now violently contradicting. She had married Nicky in part, by some accounts, to escape the suffocating control of her mother and her studio, to finally seize a life of her own. Instead, she had traded one cage for a far more dangerous one. The exit door she had chosen led straight into a room no one should ever have to enter. And she was utterly alone in it, a teenager with no real-life experience, no template for what was happening to her, and a public that believed she was living a dream. She got out. It took extraordinary courage for a teenager in 1950, a time when divorce carried real shame and women were expected to endure whatever happened inside a marriage, but Elizabeth separated from Nicky just months after the wedding. She filed for divorce on the grounds of mental cruelty, and it was granted in early 1951, less than 9 months after that spectacular ceremony. Tellingly, she asked for no alimony. She did not want a cent of the Hilton fortune. She wanted only one thing, which was to be free of him. In an era when a young divorcee risked her reputation and her career by walking away, Elizabeth chose her own safety over the fairy tale the world expected her to maintain. It was, in its way, the first act of the fierce self-determination that would define the rest of her life. And here is a detail that confirms just how dangerous Nicky Hilton really was, from a completely separate source. The actress Joan Collins, a contemporary and sometime rival of Elizabeth's, dated Nicky Hilton herself around that same era. Decades later, she described him bluntly. He was, in her words, nuts, and the relationship was frighteningly volatile. She recounted one occasion when the two of them were lying in bed, and Nicky calmly reached into a bedside drawer, pulled out a gun, and fired it into the ceiling. She speculated that Nicky Hilton had been ruined by having too much, too good-looking and too rich, and starved of love from his own father, a poisonous combination that produced a genuinely menacing young man. That was the man Elizabeth Taylor married at 18. Not a charming heir, but an unstable, violent, gun-toting alcoholic who put a young woman in fear for her life. He would die young himself, at just 42, of a heart attack tied to his hard living. The independent corroboration matters because it moves the abuse allegations out of the realm of one person's account and into a consistent portrait, confirmed by another woman who knew him, of a man who was dangerous to be near. That first marriage set a pattern that would haunt Elizabeth for decades, a pattern of searching over and over for a love that would not hurt her, and of sometimes mistaking intensity for safety and drama for devotion. And it makes the later, more famous chapters of her romantic life look very different once you understand where she started. When you know that Elizabeth Taylor's introduction to marriage was violence and the loss of a child at 18, her lifelong restlessness in love stops looking like frivolity and starts looking like a wound that never fully healed. Her next marriage would be gentler, but even it would end in quiet heartbreak, and the great love still waiting in her future would turn out to carry its own kind of violence, of a very different sort. The search for safety and the losses along the way. After escaping Nicky Hilton, Elizabeth seemed to be looking for the opposite of what she had just survived. In 1952, she married the British actor Michael Wilding, a gentle, urbane, established man 20 years her senior. In many ways, he represented safety, a calm and fatherly presence after the terror of her first marriage. It is not hard to read that choice as the direct consequence of what she had just been through. Having been brutalized by a violent young man her own age, she reached for someone older, softer, and steadier, someone who felt more like a protector than a threat. The two had 2 sons together, Michael and Christopher. But the very quality that made Wilding feel safe, his steadiness, his age, eventually became the thing that pulled them apart. As Elizabeth grew from a traumatized teenager into a confident, ferociously alive young woman and a bigger star than ever, the gap between them widened. The marriage cooled into something more like a friendship, and it ended in divorce by 1957. It was not nasty exactly, but it was another marriage that failed to give her what she was looking for, another disappointment in a search that had barely begun. Then came Mike Todd, and with him, a genuine passion. Todd was a flamboyant, larger-than-life film producer, a showman with an ego and an appetite for life as enormous as Elizabeth's own. And by many accounts, he was one of the great loves of her life, a man whose intensity matched hers. Their marriage in 1957 brought her real happiness and a daughter, Liza. By some accounts, even this relationship had its stormy moments. 2 strong personalities who could clash as passionately as they loved. But whatever friction existed, this chapter ended not in nastiness but in sudden, devastating tragedy. In March of 1958, barely a year into the marriage, Mike Todd was killed when his private plane named the Lucky Liz in Elizabeth's honor crashed in a storm over New Mexico. Elizabeth, just 26, was left a widow with an infant daughter, plunged into a grief so profound that those around her feared for her sanity and her health. She had finally found a love that did not hurt, and it had been ripped away from her by fate in an instant. It was a different kind of nastiness. Not cruelty this time, but sheer, senseless loss. And it would shape everything that came next. What happened next became one of the great scandals of the era, and it revealed a harder, more complicated side of Elizabeth's story. In her grief, she turned to Eddie Fisher, a popular singer who had been Mike Todd's close friend and had helped comfort her in the aftermath of the crash. There was just one enormous problem. Eddie Fisher was married, and married not to just anyone, but to the beloved actress Debbie Reynolds, one of America's sweethearts, with whom he had young children. When Elizabeth's relationship with Fisher became public, the reaction was savage. She was cast as a homewrecker, a scarlet woman who had stolen a devoted husband from a wholesome wife and mother. The public that had adored her, the girl from National Velvet, the tragic young widow, turned on her viciously, and the press feasted on the scandal for months. There is a real irony here that complicates the sympathetic picture, and honesty demands acknowledging it. Elizabeth was not only ever a victim in her romantic saga. In the Fisher affair, she was, by most accounts, the one who broke up a marriage, and she later owned that reality with typical candor. The same fierce hunger for love and comfort that made her sympathetic in her first marriage could, at other moments, lead her to pursue what she wanted with little regard for who stood in the way. She was a complicated, fully human figure. not a saint, and the Fisher scandal shows the other edge of that intensity. Elizabeth married Fisher in 1959, but that marriage, born of grief and scandal, was perhaps doomed from the start. She would later admit, with characteristic bluntness, that marrying Eddie Fisher had been a terrible mistake, a friggin' awful error, in her words. He had been a comfort in the aftermath of losing Todd, but he was not a great love, and the marriage was hollow at its core. It would not survive its first serious test. And that test was about to arrive in the form of a hard-drinking, silver-tongued Welsh actor on the set of the most expensive film ever made, in a collision that would define the rest of both their lives. Liz and Dick. The great love that was also a war. In 1962, Elizabeth Taylor travelled to Rome to film Cleopatra, an epic production so lavish and troubled it nearly bankrupted a studio. Her co-star, playing Mark Antony, was Richard Burton, a Welsh actor of extraordinary talent and legendary appetites, a man with a voice like rolling thunder and a reputation as a heavy drinker and a relentless womanizer. Both of them were married to other people. Elizabeth was married to Eddie Fisher. Burton was married to his wife Sybil. None of that would matter for long. The affair that ignited between Taylor and Burton on that set became a global sensation, one of the most scandalous and closely watched romances in history. The world could not look away. The press dubbed them Liz and Dick, and followed their every move with an obsessiveness that was unprecedented even for two people as famous as they were. The affair was denounced from pulpits and even, reportedly, condemned in the halls of political power as a scandal that offended public decency. Yet the condemnation only made the public more fascinated. When they finally both extricated themselves from their existing marriages and wed each other in 1964, it was crowned the marriage of the century, a title that had, ominously, been used once before. At that first doomed Hilton wedding 14 years earlier. It is a chilling little echo. The phrase that had been attached to the day her abuse began was now attached again to the union that would nearly consume her. In both cases, the grander the label the public placed on the marriage, the darker the reality turned out to be. And for a time, it truly did look like the grand romance of the age. Taylor and Burton were spectacular together, two of the biggest stars in the world, madly in love, living a life of almost cartoonish excess. They starred in film after film together, eventually 11 in all, commanding then unheard-of salaries and turning their real-life passion into box-office gold. They owned homes across the globe. A yacht, a private plane that Burton reportedly bought on a whim after they happened to fly on it. He showered her with some of the most famous jewels on the planet, enormous diamonds that became legends in their own right and are still known by name today. They were, on the surface, the most glamorous couple who had ever lived, and they played the part to the hilt, giving the public exactly the fantasy of romance and wealth it craved. But here is where the romantic legend and the actual reality split apart, and where the story gets genuinely nasty. Because the Taylor-Burton marriage, for all its passion, was also a war. The public nickname that captured them best was not Liz and Dick. It was the one the press coined for their constant, brutal conflict. They were called the Battling Burtons, and they battled. Their fights were epic, vicious, and frequent, fueled by an ocean of alcohol. Burton was already a formidable alcoholic when they met, a man who could drink staggering quantities and who carried the wounds of a hard upbringing in the Welsh coal mining valleys. And Elizabeth, tragically, developed a matching habit, along with a growing dependence on prescription pills that would shadow her for decades. Together they drank heavily and fought constantly, and the drinking and the fighting fed each other in a vicious loop. Hotel staff and co-stars described scenes of screaming, tears, hurled objects, and dramatic, tearful reconciliations, the whole exhausting cycle repeating again and again. Their arguments were so loud and so explosive that the couple reportedly took to renting the hotel suites above and below their own, simply so that no one else would have to hear the war being waged inside. Picture that, a love so famous the world envied it, conducted at a volume that required a buffer of empty rooms in every direction. It is worth being clear about what fueled all of this, because it is the part the romantic legend most wants to forget. This was not passion in the soft focus movie poster sense. This was two people with serious, worsening addictions egging each other on. Burton's own daughter has spoken openly about her father's battle with alcoholism during those years. The drinking was not a colourful footnote to the great romance. It was arguably the engine of its destruction, the thing that turned wit into cruelty, disagreement into warfare, and love into something that could genuinely frighten the people around them. When two people who both drink to excess are also both fiercely proud, verbally gifted, and used to getting their way, the arguments do not stay small. They escalate, and they wound. And the words said in them are not easily taken back. We do not have to guess about how ugly it got, because Richard Burton wrote it all down. Burton kept extensive diaries throughout his life, hundreds of thousands of words across pocketbooks and loose paper, right up until shortly before his death. And they were eventually published, laying bare the reality behind the glamour. In them, he described the marriage with a raw honesty that is startling. He wrote that he and Elizabeth lived on the edge of an exciting volcano. He admitted that he was not easy to be married to or to live with, and confessed that he exploded violently about twice a year, and that Elizabeth would explode right back. And then he wrote the line that captures the whole tragic paradox of their union. It was marvelous, he said, but it could be murder. Marvelous, but it could be murder. That was the great love story the world romanticized. The reality, in the words of the man who lived it, was two headstrong, addicted, self-destructive people who brought out both the best and the very worst in each other, whose passion was so intense it curdled, again and again, into something close to mutual destruction. They were jealous. They were competitive. Two enormous talents forever measuring themselves against each other. Burton's wandering eye led to explosive confrontations, and Elizabeth gave as good as she got. Her longtime photographer, who watched them up close for years, put it simply. Their passion was so strong that it became almost destruction. It was, he said, difficult, which was a vast understatement. There is an even darker thread running underneath the glamour of those years. During the filming of Cleopatra, at the height of the initial frenzy over their affair, with both of them still married to others and the entire world's press camped outside, Elizabeth was in such emotional turmoil that she reportedly reached a point of genuine crisis, and there were episodes during that period understood by those around her as attempts to harm herself. This was not the stuff of a fairy tale. This was a woman in real anguish, caught in a relationship whose intensity was as dangerous as it was intoxicating, and crushed by a level of public scrutiny that would have broken almost anyone. The public saw diamonds and premieres and a scandalous, thrilling romance. The private reality included breakdowns, despair, and a woman at times in real danger. If you or someone you know is struggling, this is a reminder that the glamorous surface of any story can hide profound pain, and that pain is always worth taking seriously. For 10 years, they rode that volcano. And eventually, inevitably, it consumed them. The relentless drinking, the endless fighting, the competitive careers, the sheer exhausting intensity of it all, wore them both down until there was little left to give. By 1974, the battling Burtons were emotionally spent, and they divorced. Elizabeth said simply that there had been too many differences, that she had tried everything. There is a weariness in those words that speaks volumes. This was not a couple falling out of love. It was a couple worn to the bone by a love too violent to sustain. But even that was not the end, because their bond was as impossible to break as it was to sustain. Unable to stay apart, the two reconciled and remarried in 1975 in a ceremony in Botswana, giving the great romance one more chance. It was, in hindsight, almost doomed to fail. Nothing fundamental had changed. The alcohol was still there. The volatility was still there. The two enormous personalities that could not coexist were still exactly as enormous and as incompatible as before. Remarrying did not fix any of it, and the second marriage collapsed in less than a year. They divorced again in 1976, this time for good. 2 marriages, 2 divorces to the same man inside barely more than a decade. After that final split, Elizabeth said something that reveals just how much that love had cost her. She confided that she never wanted to be that much in love ever again, because she had given everything away, her soul, her being, everything. That is not how someone describes a fairy tale. That is how someone describes surviving something that nearly destroyed her. The great romance the world remembers so fondly had, by her own account, nearly hollowed her out entirely. And yet, in one of the many contradictions that made her who she was, she also never fully stopped loving Burton. When he died of a brain hemorrhage in 1984, at just 58, worn out by his own hard living, he had reportedly just written her a letter asking whether they might try one more time. The letter arrived after his death. She was said to be devastated, still carrying, decades later, the imprint of the man who had been both the great love and the great wound of her life. What the legend leaves out. The marriages that followed were quieter, and in their own way they underline just how battered Elizabeth had been by the great loves and great wars of her earlier life. After Burton, she married John Warner, a Virginia politician who would become a United States senator. It was a stable, respectable union, but Elizabeth reportedly found herself lonely and unfulfilled in the role of a senator's wife, sidelined and bored, and she struggled during those years with her weight and with depression. That marriage ended in divorce in 1982. Her final marriage came in 1991 to Larry Fortensky, a construction worker she had met while both were in treatment at the Betty Ford Center, the rehabilitation facility where Elizabeth was courageously confronting her own decades-long struggles with alcohol and painkiller addiction. Addictions whose roots reached all the way back through the Burton years and beyond. That she ended up meeting a husband in rehab is, in a sense, the whole tragic arc of her love life compressed into a single fact. The addictions that her nastiest marriages had fueled had become their own life-threatening battle, and even her last great romance was born in the place where she went to try to save herself. That marriage, too, ended in divorce in 1996. Elizabeth Taylor never married again. She died in 2011, at the age of 79, having spent much of her later life as a beloved icon and a tireless humanitarian, the chaos of her romantic years finally behind her. Now step back and look at the whole picture, the real one, not the glossy legend. What emerges is not a carefree tale of a glamorous woman who simply loved a lot of men. It is the story of a woman who was thrown into the marriage market as a teenager by a studio that treated her as property, who was beaten and lost a child in her very first marriage, who found and then lost a great love to a plane crash, who was pilloried by the public as a villain, and who then poured herself so completely into the defining relationship of her life that it nearly destroyed her through addiction, violence of temper, and despair. Behind almost every one of those famous wedding photos was pain that the public never saw, and sometimes pain that the public actively enjoyed watching. It is worth asking why the darker truth gets forgotten. Part of it is simply that the glamour was so overwhelming. The diamonds really were enormous. The films really were iconic. The beauty really was extraordinary. It is easy, looking at the dazzling surface, to assume the life beneath it must have been just as gilded. And part of it is that Elizabeth herself was so magnificently resilient, so quick with a joke about her many husbands, so seemingly unbreakable, that the world assumed she sailed through it all untouched. She had a gift for turning her own scandals into wry one-liners, for meeting the endless scrutiny with a raised chin and a diamond and a laugh. But that public armor was exactly that. Armor. Behind it, she did not sail through anything. She survived it. There is a very great difference between the two. And perhaps that is the most important thing to understand about Elizabeth Taylor, the thing the fairy tale erases entirely. Her strength was real, but so was the suffering it was built to withstand. The woman who would go on to become one of the great humanitarians of her age, who threw herself into the fight against AIDS when the cause carried enormous stigma and stood up for the abandoned and the sick when almost no one else in her position would, had learned about pain and abandonment and cruelty firsthand, in her own home, over and over, beginning when she was just 18 years old and pregnant and afraid. Perhaps it was precisely because she knew what it was to suffer in silence, to be hurt behind a beautiful facade, that she became so fierce in defending others who were suffering. The compassion grew out of the wounds. So the next time you see one of those famous images, Elizabeth Taylor, radiant in white satin, or draped in the Burton diamonds, laughing beside her handsome husband, remember that the picture is only half the story. The other half is nastier, sadder, and far more human. It is the story of a woman who spent much of her life searching, through 8 marriages and 7 husbands, for something she had been denied at the very start. A love that would simply, finally, not hurt her. She did not always find it, and she was not always innocent in the searching. But she never stopped trying. That she kept loving, kept getting up after each disaster and reaching for happiness again may be the most remarkable thing about her. Not the glamour, the endurance beneath it. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.